History now confirms that Portugal was the first European country to start the ugly act of slavery and colonization. As early as the 14th through to the 15th century, the Portuguese explorers were already moving out of Lisbon to survey different parts of the continent of Africa. If there was any doubt, the presence of several padraos, which were pillars designed by the Portuguese to claim territory, are to be found in different parts of Africa. And you will note that as you move through the coastal part of Western Africa up to the eastern part where you find monuments such as Fort Jesus, you see the footprints of the Portuguese and the activities of individuals such as Vasco da Gama and Francisco de Almeida. Slavery, of course, was the very first engagement with African chiefs. And it is important to note that although some historians make the claim that African chiefs were involved in slavery, it must not be lost to us that their engagement was under duress and that the Portuguese army, as it was then constituted, did compel them to engage in activities which then led to modern-day slavery. And after slavery had started in earnest, it must also be understood that Portugal, as well as Spain, for some reason, had great sway on the papacy. And at that time, the papacy based in Rome was very powerful and indeed divided the world for purposes of survey between Portugal and Spain. But let us focus on the Portuguese activities in the continent of Africa. They started in areas such as Cabo Verde, or what is known in the anglicized form as Cape Verde. And what happened in that area is that the Portuguese invaded and in many ways dominated the communities through colonization. From Cabo Verde, they moved into Guinea-Bissau in the western part of Africa, and in certain areas, they built their monuments but did not quite establish themselves as colonizers. What they did was to use the basis for purposes of collecting slaves and taking them to Latin America or South America, particularly in Brazil. It is not lost on us that, in fact, one of the largest black populations to be found in Southern America is to be found in Brazil, where the dominant language, as we know, is Portuguese. They then moved to Angola. And in Angola, they established one of their most important colonies and, of course, continued with the acquisition of many things, including artifacts, which had been created by the African populations at that time. And all these were taken to Lisbon. As they moved to Angola, they moved across the other part of Africa and found themselves in what is present-day Mozambique. Of course, we are told that the initial motivation for the Portuguese explorations was to find spice in different parts of the world, particularly in India, where we know that they established a kingdom or established themselves in Goa. But in East Africa, they did indeed arrive and established a colony in Mozambique. In the eastern coast of Africa, it is instructive that they were present for some time. And when you visit the coastal city of Mombasa, Fort Jesus remains as a monument to the Portuguese establishment in that area. Ultimately, they did not settle in that part of the world and did not colonize, but they ended up being very present in terms of the activities and in terms of the monuments that they built. The Portuguese were very interesting, and I think Samora Machel of Mozambique has described them in a very unique way. He says that of all the colonizing powers, the poorest of them, even in Europe, was Portugal. But for some reason, because it was a littoral or sea-based country, she succeeded in engaging in exploration very early on. And their style of colonization, when they transited from slavery into colonization was very unique. They identified a small elite, and this small elite was made to engage in activities that converted them into Portuguese, including the naming. Not that this was unique to Portugal, but it is important to understand that individuals who had been identified by the Portuguese were then taken to Lisbon. And when they were in Lisbon, they were inducted and made to think that they were Portuguese. And there is no shortage of such individuals who later, of course, participated in the struggle for independence. It is instructive that the Portuguese, unlike colonizers such as the British and to a certain extent the French and to a limited extent the Germans, because they did not stay for a long time as colonizers, did not engage in the development of the territories that they occupied. And this is evident even today. Apart from Cabo Verde, which in the recent past has developed in different areas, a visit to Guinea-Bissau will demonstrate that beyond the port of Guinea-Bissau, very little was done in terms of education, in terms of the health infrastructure. This is also evident in Angola. It's only a small population that was privileged and that was made to benefit from the largesse of the Portuguese. Otherwise, in the hinterland, there were no railways to talk about, there were no roads to talk about, and they used the locals to ensure that whatever they wanted from the hinterland was then brought to the shores, as one will see in Angola with Luanda in Angola, which, as we know, was named for Sao Paulo de Luanda, St. Paul of Luanda. And when one crosses to Mozambique, and it is important today that when we talk about Maputo, we forget that it was actually known as Lourenço Marques, named by the British in that regard. And when they moved into Mozambique, once again, one sees that their concentration was in Maputo, in Nampula, and in those coastal areas with very limited activity designed to improve agriculture or designed to improve health. And the Portuguese came to settle in the areas that they were present. There is a sense in which the Portuguese elite did not intend to leave. You see this in Guinea-Bissau, you see this in Cabo Verde, and as of course said, in Angola and in Mozambique. And that is why Portuguese colonization was perhaps the most pernicious. So that when the struggle for liberation of Africa commenced in earnest, and when what was described as the wind of change started taking root, and many European colonizers took the cue and were beginning to let go their colonies, the same was not true of Portugal. Portugal stuck to their colonies, and one can understand why. It's a small country in Europe, not a major power outside of the exploration, but is a power that depended very much, even in terms of its economic well-being, from the colonies. Portugal is Portugal because of what she was deriving from her colonies in Africa and elsewhere. And they did not want to let go. It is also instructive that within Portugal itself, domination was an aspect of it in terms of different political powers or political players wanting to dominate, with the consequence that Portugal was not at peace and was led by dictators. So that when everybody else was struggling to regain independence, Portugal was not interested in granting independence or surrendering to the struggle. And when one looks at the Portuguese colonies, they became the most violent, and most of the leaders of the struggle for independence in Portugal were then accused of being communist because they had turned to the Soviet Union. This is true of Amílcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, and we note that the struggle against the Portuguese was so intense, with the consequence, as we know, that Guinea-Bissau was to be granted independence much later out of a struggle, which then forced the negotiations, leading ultimately to the death of Amílcar Cabral, who was assassinated in Guinea in Conakry. In Angola, the same was true in terms of the individuals who then rose. And it is not lost on me that the leader at that time who emerged and who was then, of course, also referred to as a communist was Agostinho Neto. And Neto emerged. He was educated in Portugal, became a poet, was a medical doctor himself, and he engaged in a struggle which is very well documented, the MPLA, and ultimately we know that the Americans also inducted Holden Roberto, who was based in Congo at that time, to in many ways neutralize Neto, who was seen as a communist. And of course, we also know that Jonas Malheiro Savimbi with UNITA was also introduced into the fray. But once again, we know that there was a veritable struggle, and is instructive that the parties themselves were involved in a lot of struggles which culminated in a meeting which was held in Kenya in 1975, which then led to the independence of Angola. Mozambique was difficult. Mozambique was difficult because the Mozambican struggle, for some reason, Mozambique was a darling of the Portuguese and they did not want to leave. And by the time that they were leaving, it was because of a struggle that had been mounted by Frelimo. Frelimo, as we know, had major important leaders who were in exile in Tanzania, headquartered initially in Morogoro in Tanzania, then moved to Lusaka in Zambia, and we now know that the founding leader at that time, Eduardo Mondlane, was the victim of a letter bomb which was sent to him in Dar es Salaam, and he succumbed to the injuries, leaving the field for one of the greatest freedom fighters against Portuguese, Samora Moises Machel, who then led the freedom fight and led to the expulsion of the Portuguese. But it's important to note that there were things also happening within the domestic arena in Portugal which actually led to the ultimate surrender of the Portuguese against the freedom fighting movement. For a long time, during the 1950s, 1960s, the Portuguese dictatorship led by Marcelo Caetano had actually taken a vow that they were not going to allow the colonized territories in Africa to be independent. It was only in 1974 when there was a coup d'etat which removed the Marcelo Caetano government and brought in the administration of Antonio de Spinola, that the Spinola administration said, we are not going to continue to engage in these wars. It's bleeding Portugal, and therefore we are going to begin to let go Cabo Verde, let go Guinea-Bissau, let go Angola, let go Mozambique, and ultimately the Portuguese colonies were liberated from a Portugal that was a reluctant and a pernicious colonizer who did not do much to develop the countries that they were interested in, because she herself was a backwater European country with a very weak economy and was capable of sustaining herself and indeed sustaining her economies, the economies of our colonized people. History records that Portugal was indeed one of the worst colonizers, running from slavery, the stealing of artifacts, and the decimation of local populations, and making sure that their language, Portugal, was dominant. A terrible colonizer Portugal was. We are in the tea plantations in Limuru, and we say goodbye as we continue the conversations around Africa.